Peter Drucker, the father of modern management, he said, a business is there to create a customer. The only two things that add value to a business are innovation and marketing. And if you understand your customers, your marketing will be a lot more effective.
The Industrial Growth Institute podcast connects you with the big thinkers, makers, and subject matter experts across all aspects of an integrated B2B industrial revenue growth function. From strategy, board oversight, and transactions, through all the phases of manufacturing marketing, the complexities of industrial sales, and the nuances of marketing and sales technology and customer experience, I speak with guests who bring insights, innovative perspectives, best practices, and twists on traditional approaches. Each episode explores high-level thinking and in-the-weeds actionable tactics. If you enjoyed these discussions, then please help me out by liking and sharing the podcast, and especially by leaving a comment and giving a review. So with no further ado, let's jump into this episode. Hi there, I'm Ed Marsh, host of the Industrial Growth Institute podcast. One of the challenges of finding the right path to predictable revenue growth is that there are so many right answers or surefire solutions. And as the saying goes, opinions are like armpits. Everyone has them and they all stink. So if you're a business owner trying to figure out how to grow, how do you cut through all the opinions? And that's what Douglas Burdett, my guest today, has helped so many folks to do. Doug is the host of the Marketing Book Podcast, which is a weekly interview with the author of a new marketing or sales book that Douglas actually reads before each interview, unlike many folks. He's been running it for just shy of 10 years now. The show was actually named by LinkedIn and Forbes, amongst others, as one of the top marketing podcasts. It has millions of downloads, listeners in over 185 countries. And according to Listen Notes, the show is in the top 0.5% of over 3 million podcasts worldwide. In a few weeks from when we're recording, which is now in early July of 2024, the podcast is actually going to pass its 500 episode milestone, at which point Douglas is going to stop. He's going out on top. So why marketing books? Well, Douglas is a long time. He calls himself kind of at the tail end of the madman era, having spent 15 years on Madison Ave at ad industry giants, including J. Walter Thompson and Gray Advertising, before he started his own marketing agency in 2001. He recently wound that marketing agency down. It was called Artillery Marketing. Why the name? Well, in contrast to many in the marketing space, Douglas is a graduate of VMI. He served as a U.S. Army artillery officer in Cold War Germany before earning his MBA. So I know that somebody who's read more than 500 marketing books and spent 40 years in advertising and marketing, been a HubSpot partner for many years, they're going to have a lot of gold insights into marketing. But I'm also expecting some irreverent humor knowing Douglas as I do. So I'd say buckle up. And of course, be sure to like, share, comment, subscribe, do all those things that you know you're supposed to do when you listen to a podcast. When Douglas's show ends in a month or so, another one's going to have to fill a spot. So let's get some activity around this one. So with all that, welcome, Douglas. Thank you.
Thanks. Good to be here and speaking with an infantryman.
All right, so I want to be clear off the top. It's Douglas, not Doug, right?
Well, I answer to both, and my older brothers call me worse, so either one. I write it as Douglas, but other than that, either's fine.
Got it. All right. You communicate, I think, more than anybody else I know with GIFs. Is that a product of your midlife stand-up comedy stint, or is that for efficiency, or is it so that you leave people wondering the real intent? What's the point of that?
Well, I was the youngest of 4 children, so I was the funny one. And I like making people laugh. I like entertaining people. And I just like those things. And I have a folder of a few that I use all the time. So it actually is not very difficult.
I want to be honest with everyone. Normally, I don't accept any guest ground rules, but I did in this case. You stipulated to me no kind of Oprah-style metaphysical sorts of questions. And I know that you've had some encounters in the past. You're reluctant to agree to interviews when that happens. So I may kind of tweak you up against the edge a couple times. And I'm not going to ask you to share some sort of a philosophical life journey. However, I will say, as a veteran, that part of your journey is an important piece of this conversation for me. I know you come from a military family. Was it expected that you would go to West Point or VMI or the Citadel?
Oh, no, not at all. And actually, the reason I don't really answer those questions is because I don't know the answers. And it's not generally interesting for podcast listeners to find out about my life's journey and all that sort of thing. But I was from a military family, and I actually had two older brothers who didn't go into the military. They didn't feel any pressure to, but I thought it was interesting. And, I think a lot of people go into a line of work that their mom or dad did, and I started out that way. I certainly was aware of it, so I thought I'd give it a try, and I'm glad I did. Once I got in, I realized I didn't want to make a career of it.
Well, maybe that's because you went into the artillery. No, I mean, did you fall for that PR line about King of Battle, or what?
Well, I figured I would go infantry because my dad was infantry, and his dad was infantry, and all the way back to the Revolutionary War. But I just didn't enjoy crawling on the ground as much as somebody like Ed Marsh. And then when I was doing some training at Fort Bragg one summer, they made us aware of all the different branches, and I was really fascinated by artillery. So, and I knew they needed field artillery officers, and I knew they needed them in Germany. So I put down field artillery as my first choice, and then I asked them, what are the two most popular? And I put those as 2 and 3. And then I put down Germany, and then I said, what are the other two that are most popular? And they said, well, everybody wants to go to Hawaii. So I put that second. So it was really pretty easy. So no, I didn't feel any pressure, and I found it very interesting.
For those that may not be familiar, infantry is known as the Queen of Battle. I'm embarrassed. I don't know how it got that name, but infantry, artillery, armor, air defense, artillery, I guess, aviation, engineers, I think maybe now special forces added to it. They're known as the combat arms branches. And there's a fair amount of good-natured competition between them. So a little bit of the ribbing between the Queen of Battle and the King of Battle. Your dad, as you mentioned, was an infantryman, and then I think he became one of the real giants in the development of Army rotary wing aviation.
Yeah, he was an infantry officer, a rifle company commander in World War II, fighting the Germans, and battalion commander in the Korean War, and then along the way, the Army realized that aviation was really going to play a much bigger role after the Korean War, so they sent him as a lieutenant colonel to learn how to fly, which is why I was born at the Army Aviation Center. And then he was very involved in Army aviation, 3 tours of the Pentagon, 2 tours of Vietnam doing that, and liked it very much. And then they promoted him again and said, enough of the aviation. You've had your fun. Now we need you to go do a few other things.
Got it. Well, and in kind of remembrance of your artillery marketing agency, I had on my desk for many years a hand grenade stress ball. I looked for it in preparation for this podcast. I couldn't find it. I guess somewhere along the way it moved. There it is. That's not mine, but mine was lost somewhere.
There's more where they come from, Ed, and I'm now
lob
looking
one
for
my way, but leave the pin in.
Yes, will do.
Right.
I'll send it downrange.
Perfect. So, mentioning PR in terms of the battle between King of Battle and Queen of Battle, let's talk about marketing. You spent years in advertising, and something that's always perplexed me. What's the difference between advertising and marketing?
Advertising is just a subset of marketing.
Okay.
So one way to frame that is the popular framework called the 4 Ps of marketing. So you'll meet a lot of companies, particularly in the industrial space, who say, we've grown for 30 years. We've never done any marketing. And I will then say, well, how do you set your prices? And they'll have long explanations. I say, now, how do you get your product to your customers? And they'll have pretty detailed explanations. And I say, well, those are part of marketing as well. So the 4 Ps are the product. What is your product? What problem do you solve? And you usually get lots of answers there. Product, price. That's one of the 4. Is like, how do you price it? And there's so many different ways to price something. That's a big part of marketing, is pricing. Mm-hmm. And the 3rd P might be place, which is distribution. Do you go to your customers? Do they come to you? Is it online? That's something. And those 3 are often enough for a lot of companies. The fourth P is promotion. And that could be 25, 50, 100 different things. Advertising is just one aspect of promotion. Now, the reason that people think of advertising as being so powerful is because for the last 100, 150 years, advertising was really, really very powerful. So you had more or less captive audiences who had to see your ads or hear your ads on the radio. There were no podcasts. They had to watch your television commercials. There was no time shifting, no DVRs, no streaming. Those were the good old days, Ed. And so, we could run an ad on network television, and sure enough, all things being equal, you'd start to see the client's market share increase. Awareness leads to preference. So that's just one part. Now, advertising has, the power of it has declined. It's still very powerful in the right instance, but for a long time, advertising was the 800-pound gorilla, and you would think, well, we need to advertise. And actually, there are a lot of companies that think they need to advertise when not as much as they might think. In other words, we've actually had clients in the past where we got the client and the advertising recommendation after we did a little bit of research about the company was to stop all advertising because their product was so messed up. They needed to make it better before they start promoting again, because as we used to say in the ad business, nothing kills a bad product faster than really good advertising. So you're going to die, your company's going to die. We're just going to help it die faster.
Wow.
So that's why, marketing, people often say, if I only had $1 for marketing, what should I do with it? And sometimes my answer is, well, I would probably first, before I spent money paying for advertising, is figure out, am I doing everything I can to sell to and help my current customers? That's one of the most overlooked aspects of revenue growth and business growth is selling to your current customers. Too many companies make the sale and move on and don't keep in touch with their customers and find out more about their customers. So, if I were working for an ad agency, they would have said, don't say that, take the money. But that's one, it kind of comes down to, people are going to think, oh, this guy's read 500-600 sales and marketing books, which I really enjoy doing. And they're going to say, what he's describing is quite simple, but it's really, really difficult for companies to do. And one of those is understand your customers. Listen to your customers. Don't go to them and ask, what do you want? Understand where the friction is in your customer's life. And right off the bat, you will be resonating with them more. If you simply understand them.
If most industrial companies would simply go and ask that question, what do you want? They'd be far ahead of where they are instead of just saying, this is what we have and this is why you ought to want it.
Yeah, well, it's true. But somebody would have said, no one, Steve Jobs or Apple, for example, they didn't go to people and say, what do you want? They would go and they would just understand their customers. And they realized that what people wanted was something they couldn't necessarily articulate. And so anyway, there's all kinds of books where that explains, the crux of so many of these fantastic books is about simply understanding your customer. Mm-hmm. And another one is, how easy are we making it to do business with us, which requires a lot of empathy and understanding. And part of the problem is that as companies grow, they get very focused on themselves and their operations, and I get that, but it's almost like a gravitational pull that pulls them away from their customers. Right. But the more that companies can assign one person, maybe a marketing person, to being the expert on the customer and how they buy and what their objections are, I've just seen it hundreds or thousands of times where that's kind of the secret sauce. It brings to mind this story about Amazon. And I've heard this many times. In fact, I even interviewed an author who, U.S. Navy veteran, by the way, since we're talking about veterans here, he was one of the first guys hired at Amazon. And he told the same story. And that is, one day, Jeff Bezos came in to talk to his key people. He went to a lot of meetings, various conference rooms. And he would say, look, folks, from now on, I want one empty chair in any meeting where I'm present. And the reason why is because that empty chair is going to represent the customer. And what would happen was he would start pointing at the chair and he would say, that's not what she wants. Or no, we know what happened when we did that to him before. And then people would get ready for meetings with the boss man, and they'd say, oh no, he's going to point at that damn chair. Oh, I forgot about the customer. Wait a minute. We need to rethink this. I don't want to look stupid. Right. But even a big company like that has to a lot of work to do to try to keep a focus on the customer.
So I was going to ask, based on all your years running the agency, what you think the biggest misconception is that most mid-sized businesses have about marketing. And maybe you've answered that. Maybe it's the misconception is that marketing is primarily about things you do. And you're saying effective marketing is really primarily about understanding the buyer.
Yeah. Marketing, and this is why some people would get upset when they started to discover, or maybe I would explain, marketing now has more to do with how you run your company than what you say about your company.
Sure.
It's really not so much about what you say about your company, because people don't believe, and I've got all the research, people don't really believe what companies say about themselves. And most of the time when companies talk about themselves, it's inane and it's not helpful and it's not believable.
Right.
And it's not about what can you do for me? In other words, most websites you go to, particularly in the industrial space, most are about them. Yep. They're weeing all over themselves. And by that, I mean, we were founded in 1879, or we do this, or we do that.
Right.
Somebody goes to the website, and if they quickly realize that the website is more about them, the customer, you are on the fast track to sales. But most companies aren't do that. They don't do the hard work of focusing on the problem they solve for their customers.
Right.
So the other thing is that people believe what their friends or their connections say about a company.
Mm-hmm. And
just below that, they believe what perfect strangers say about a company more than they believe what the company says. So the referrals are very important. And what's funny is that referrals are the warmest lead you can get. They close at the highest rate. And yet most companies don't have a system in place to properly ask for referrals.
Right. And
that's where, again, back to you're dealing with, we're talking about a world of a lot of engineers and very process-oriented people who understand systems. And the way to get referrals is to incorporate that and make it a system of asking. And there are entire books about how to build referrals into
Sure.
into your sales process, into what you're doing. And the worst thing you can do is say, do you know anybody that needs what we do? That's absolutely the worst way to do it. So there's books about it, and I can share with you about that. But that's an example. You might not need to pay for something to promote your business, and you don't need to. And in fact, you don't want to start with that. You want to think about your product, the problem you solve for your customers, how easy you're making it to do business with them. Right. And there's a book that you're familiar with called Hug Your Haters by Jay Baer. He writes fantastic books. And he explains that only about 4% of your customers will ever complain. 96% will just go away, and or they will tell people about the bad experience they've had. But when you get a complaint from a customer, that's like somebody throwing a lifeline to you after you've been thrown off the boat. That's really valuable information. And in the old days, you would pay for that, a lot of money to a research company to get that kind of information. It's up to you to listen to it. But most often they want you to hear them and fix the problem. So anyway, I'm sure I'm bursting a lot of perceptions of what marketing is, but it has to do more with the leadership at the company and how you view your customers, how you help them, the kind of experience that they have. So in other words, you've probably heard the Maya Angelou quote, about people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. And so there's a really good reason why smart growth-oriented companies are sitting back and thinking about how are we making people feel as they first reach out to us, before they even get to know us, by the actions that we take throughout our relationship with them.
We're going to talk a little bit later about sales and marketing alignment. But in a world where buyers are 70% of the way through their journey, or whatever the latest statistic is, and where they vacillate between activities and thinking and questions that we normally associate with marketing versus those we normally associate with sales, and they're back and forth between them, the ability of a company through its website, through chatbots, through availability of setting up meetings, through sharing information without long forms, all that kind of stuff, to be able to make the person comfortable wherever they are in their buying journey and connect them with the right person, regardless of what department title that person has, becomes critical.
Yeah. Make them feel safe. I mean, most of the time, even after they've bought from you, people are worried that they're making the wrong decision. And there's quite a bit that you can do to make people feel like they're making the right decision. And there was even a lot of new research that came out in a book last year called The Jolt Effect. And that was written by one of the co-authors is Matt Dixon, who wrote The Challenger Sale and The Challenger Customer years ago. And what they found out is that during the lockdown, all the field sales folks had to get online. You couldn't go visit like you could in the past. And there are probably a lot of field salespeople that would get on a plane or go drive to see somebody at the very outset, which you don't really necessarily want to do, and people don't want you to do that. But all these, they analyzed like 2.5 million recorded sales calls, which all this great software can do. And then what they did is they had it all the audio transcribed, and they used a lot of machine learning. And one of the things they did is they overlaid the conversations that the top salespeople had, and what were they doing differently from the others, kind of like the Challenger Sale, where they broke it out into about 6 different types of salespeople, all based on lots of research, and determined that the most effective people were the ones that were comfortable challenging the customer. And it's more to that than being a 24-year-old salesperson who thinks you're supposed to argue with your customer. That's not what the Challenger Sale is about. And what they determined is that most people, even if let's say it's a buying group, they're looking at buying a new, whatever kind of machinery or whatever, a lot of people involved, careers are involved, a lot of money's involved, maybe the future of the company's involved, or it could be software or something like that. They know they need to make a decision. They're standing on an anthill, more or less. And that's what salespeople have traditionally been quite good at, helping them understand that the fear of change is greater than the fear of same. In other words, you've got to move. And we don't like that. We don't like having change. It's risky. But what they found out in this research is that like 87% of all these sales, the people, even though they knew they need to make a change, they were actually more afraid of making a decision. I don't think we all realized just how terrified people are to make a decision. So in a lot of the corporate world, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, there's more risk in making a decision. And it's actually probably even more prevalent in the business to government world. There's almost nothing to gain by making a big decision. And so they then lay out in the book the things that the successful salespeople did to help people get past that last part, whereas traditionally a salesperson would just continue the fear of missing out, all the way to the end, and it's actually not helpful. It's counterproductive. You've got to stop back and just say, okay, they understand they need to change. that's not the finish line. We now have to get them past this second hurdle. So interesting stuff for sales and marketing nerds like you and me.
Yeah, I think that's a huge book, because it really does sit at the intersection of marketing and sales, and how that relationship needs to be managed. I love the visualization of a Rubicon that the prospect passes from the FOMO stage, the fear of missing out. We got to make a change because we can't keep doing what we're doing, to the FOMO or FOFU, depending on whether you're R-rated or not, the fear of messing up stage. And when they
That's a great way to put it.
Geez, we're better off not doing it. Nobody gets fired for buying IBM. Nobody gets fired for maintaining the current situation.
Yeah. It's it just like so many of the books that Matt Dixon has been involved with. There's just so much research behind it that you can't dismiss it as his opinion. But he shows, like so many great authors, will let the research guide them instead of their own preconception. So people realize the wolf's at the door. They've got to change, but then they just don't want to be the one to pull that trigger.
And that's why 40% of deals are ending in no decision.
Yeah, and the folly of a lot of that is people think, oh, they're happy with the status quo. Not really. Sometimes, but most of the time, they're just too terrified to make a decision.
Right. Yeah, I think decision maker is kind of a faulty term these days, because yes, it's true that somebody carries a P&L. Yes, it's true that somebody could override the committee decision, but they invite the committee in to make the decision, consciously aware of the fact that they're probably not going to override it because they don't want to be on the hook for overriding it. And the committee often doesn't want to make a decision because they don't want to be on the hook. And so everyone is incentivized to not make a decision. So it's not so much the status quo being selected as it ends up happening that way by default.
Yeah. But, it's one of those things where if you are able to say, look, at this stage, you're probably thinking this way. We encounter that a lot. These are some additional things that might be helpful at this time for you all to work through this issue. And again, like so many things, covered in so many of the books on the podcast, you don't have to be perfect at any of this. You just have to be a little bit better than your competition, and they will be blown away.
Right.
Not unlike running from a bear. If you and your friend are running from a bear, do you have to be faster than the bear, Ed?
Just faster than your fat friend.
And if you're not, shoot him in the knee and then proceed on. So, but it's like, it's amazing how surprised people, prospects get when you shine just a little bit of light on them.
Right. You got into podcasting really pretty early. I mean, 10 years ago. Did you see where it was going? Did you just decide you wanted to experiment for fun? What prompted you to make that move?
Well, I always liked listening to podcasts. And before podcasts, I'd always listen to any kind of talk radio, AM, NPR, sports radio. I just enjoyed hearing people talk. And so when the first marketing podcast came around, it was back before we had these nice iPhones, plug the little player in your computer and upload a new episode. I just loved it. And I always enjoyed listening to marketing podcasts. And I particularly enjoyed podcasts where authors were interviewed. And so in 2014, I said, I think I might want to do that, just because I learned so much by listening to these authors talk, and I enjoyed reading the books and got to meet a few authors at conferences and things like that. And then one day I said, I went on GoDaddy, and I looked up and saw that marketingbookpodcast.com was available. And I said, I don't have any excuse now. That's a sign that I gotta do this. And so I just thought, let me give this a try. I think I could do that. And I made 11 videos in my studio in the office, pitching these 11 different authors, saying, hey, I'm going to start this podcast. Some of them I had met before, said, I'd like to know if you'd be interested in being one of the first guests. And ultimately, I interviewed all 11. One of them was a delay just because he didn't have a book for a while. But so I started it, and it was one of those things where I did not start the podcast for a business reason. I started it more or less as professional development, as performance art. It was kind of like having a workout friend or a running group, or recently I joined a rowing club, and you go because there's 7 other people that are going to be in that boat. They're kind of counting on you. So right. I just kept it going. And I think I would have done it even if I didn't have that many listeners. It really wasn't sort of the point. And so the next thing I knew, after about a year or two, I was getting contacted by a lot of authors, and I got on the list of all the publishers, and started hearing from listeners around the world who liked it and thanked me for it. And I mean, there's nothing better than that. It's probably like being a volunteer church organist where people thank you and you want to keep doing it because you want to help and do that sort of thing. And so I just kept going. But what's interesting is that I did it for very personal reasons, because I wanted to keep learning, and I didn't want to feel like a Don Draper dinosaur ad man. But I gave a talk recently at a big conference not a big conference, but a very nice conference in Wisconsin called Experience Inbound. And they asked me, can you come and just talk about podcasting? And I said, sure. It was the 10th year, and they had a lot of people in previous years saying we'd like to learn more about podcasting. So I came and gave this talk and explained, this is tied to, did I just want to try it out? Most podcasts never make it past 7 episodes. And I just read the other day that like 90% of podcasts only have 3 episodes. So I explained why that happens, and, how you can be more successful at podcasting. It's a slow build. It's not the first thing I would recommend to any of your audience if they're not doing the other things we already talked about. But it's great for certain things. Right. So we just have a bigger toolbox of tactics available to us, and some work well for certain things, and some others don't. So I kept going because I was sort of on a Blues Brothers mission from God. I just wanted to keep learning, and and then after a while, I knew that people were enjoying the show and they were benefiting from it. And recently, when I announced that I was going to draw it to a close and retire, the people really came out of the woodwork, and most of them were fake angry with me, like, I hate you. You can't stop this show. I do. My Fridays mornings are spent listening to, whatever. And a lot of people say, well, how can we keep it going? And I'm like, I appreciate that, but I don't want to be responsible for it. And so, yeah, that's the long answer to, that's how I got into the podcasting space.
You've obviously interviewed hundreds of authors, read hundreds of books. Is it possible for you to kind of pick the 2 or 3 that you think are the fundamental building blocks that every B2B industrial business owner needs to read?
Well, the most important one is the one that had the biggest impact on my career and life. And it's a book by Sarah Cooper, and it's called 100 Tricks to Appear Smart in Meetings: How to Get By Without Even Trying. Now, it was an April Fool's Day episode, and she's a comedian who later had a show on Netflix, but she had actually been an engineer at Google and Yahoo. And the book is hilarious because this is a joke. That's not really the answer. But she has in this book these tricks to appear smart in meetings. And one of them is translate percentages into fractions at a meeting. And so when somebody's looking, at a meeting and they're pointing at the screen and they say about 25% of visitors click on this button, you then say, so about 1 in 4. Your math skills will be the envy of everyone in that room. And she came up with that because I think it was her first day at one of those jobs, and she was in a meeting and some more senior person said that, and she thought it was a joke, and she almost burst out laughing. But it was her first day, so she didn't laugh, and she then just started writing these things down. That's how another one was, and you probably saw this in the military. I saw generals do this all the time, where ask the presenter to go back a slide. It makes everybody think you're paying more attention than you actually are. And then you can go back to doing what you were doing, which is checking Instagram. But I think there are a number of books, and there's a one that's by a guy in your neck of the woods in Boston, Louis Gadima. You may know him. Mm-hmm. And he wrote Bullseye Marketing. And then I loved it so much. I said, you've got to write a second edition. And he said, okay, only if you write the foreword to it. So then I stopped urging authors to write books, but it's a great book for B2B marketing. And one of the things that's so helpful is that, and I hadn't seen this in any other book until then, was this idea of the bullseye. So you've got like a bullseye and you got maybe 2 rings around it, let's say. And not just because I was in the artillery that I'm fascinated with targets, but what a lot of companies will do is they'll try to increase awareness and get new customers, where he explains that what you should be doing, like I mentioned earlier, is the bullseye are your current customers. Focus on them. There's probably a lot more you can help them with. And how many times have your people in your audience encountered a customer who said, oh, I didn't realize you all did that. I thought you just did that one thing you're doing for me. So you start with them, and that could also be people, not just customers, but also people that you're already engaged with who have raised their hand and they're looking to buy and they're talking to you. Focus on them first. And then the second ring is people who, as we say in the biz, maybe have shown some intent data. So that's where you try to get people who are, maybe looking, they're in the market, maybe only 5% of customers are actually looking right now. And there's ways to target them. And then the outer ring is people that have never heard of you and are not really looking right now. That's where you're trying to generate awareness. That's the last thing you should be focusing on if you want faster revenue growth. Sure. And I love the way he presented that, because so many people, particularly in our agency world, that you try to guide folks you try to guide companies in the right direction, but then, telling them, what are you doing right now with your current customers? And it's almost like, Ed, I'm sure you've seen this, where they say, no, I just want to write a check and have magic happen. I don't actually want to deal with my own salespeople.
Maybe a viral video.
Oh God. I don't want to deal with my sales manager who I'm intimidated by. I don't really understand what those salespeople are doing. I don't want to deal with my own operations. That's where you got to start. And so that was a great one. And there was another book that was on the show recently called Lean Marketing. And this is by Alan Dib. He's also the guy that wrote the bestseller, The One-Page Marketing Plan, which is just ingenious. You summarize it on one page, but there are other things that go in it. I just love the way he framed both of his books, and they're great for people that are new to the idea of marketing and what do I need to do. I just heard from a listener who said, no, we're in that situation. I don't know where to start. I don't know what to do. And I'm like, first off, don't spend any money just yet.
Right.
Let me give you some groundworks on how to think about that. And so his book, Lean Marketing, very new. It was really, really well done. And what's interesting there is that he showed you what's important. He does a great job of separating the signal from the noise. And it reminds me of a buddy of mine from VMI. And he was electrical engineer and went into engineering. And after 25, 30 years, he called me up one day. We'd kept in touch, but he called me up and said, Doug, I'm the CEO of this manufacturing company now. I've never had to deal with marketing. I don't really know what those folks are doing. I don't know how I can help them. It's so overwhelming. What do I need to do? Explain this to me. This is like a private conversation.
At least he has a question, though. So often they just decide, okay, we'll do another trade show.
Yeah. Well, and that's why my friend Frank was so successful. But he was like, what's the deal? Right. And none of these people are dumb. Okay. It just wasn't something it wasn't problems they had spent their career solving. And after about 45 minutes, he was like, oh man, thank you. Now I see what we're trying to accomplish. And he probably thought it's all about advertising. Not at all.
Right.
Not at all. So those are two books that pop into my head very quickly. There were also some books on the show about how to sell to technical audiences, which might be helpful for your audience. Mm-hmm. So another one was Smart Marketing for Engineers by Rebecca Geier. You may know her. She was with True Marketing in Austin, and they focused, and the agency's still there. She's gone on, but Wendy Covey, her partner, she's still running the company, and they explained, they did a lot of research about how to sell to a technical audience. Okay. And then Wendy wrote a book called Content Marketing Engineered, which is a similar thing, but it had more specifically about content marketing. Those are both great books on how to guide folks. But the dirty little secret is every single industry, every single company will say, Ed, that's real good, but we're different. Everybody says we're different, and I get it. But as Marcus Sheridan, the author of the great book, one of my favorites, They Ask You Answer, that's another good one for people that are new to this. And we used it a lot for clients. Is that, we're all in the trust business. We just happen to be selling CNC machines, or we happen to be selling consulting services, or we happen to be selling new roofs. It's a matter of gaining the trust of people. And one of the worst things you can do is talk about your product right off the bat, which so many people in your space do. Right. A book that comes to mind about that was by a couple of guys in England who wrote a book. Paul Cash was one of them. The book is called Humanizing B2B. And it's the best book I've read about why starting with what they call speeds and feeds, product features, is one of the worst things you can do. And they explain it. They have all the research that show what an emotional purchase a B2B purchase is. A B2B purchase is much more emotional than buying the wrong roofing job for your house.
Right.
It's your career is at stake. People are going to remember forever you made the wrong thing. You might put your business out of that's why there's so many people involved in these purchases. That's a great one. And they actually show how if you start out with that information, completely skipping past an understanding of what the stresses and friction are for your customer, they're going to put you to the side. If you don't even acknowledge, remember I said a website, the more that you can signal to a customer that you understand them, the more successful you'll be. They follow the same idea. The other one, the second edition of They Ask You Answer, is a great book for B2B people, I've found, and we used it a lot for clients, and it was really successful. And I'll just end with one other suggestion, Buyer Personas, which is a book that came out in 2015
is that by the Adele Revella book?
Yeah, founder of the Buyer Persona Institute. Right. And a couple of weeks ago, I interviewed Jim Krause because Adele and Jim wrote the second edition. And that'll be one of our last episodes. Yeah, it's you heard it here first, That's why everyone should subscribe to the Marketing Group podcast for another month or so. But it's a fantastic book, and it helps you understand your customer. Remember back to the first thing I was saying? And the truth is, there's a specific way to go about it, but there's really just 5 insights you need to know about your customer. And if you do, it gives you an unfair advantage. And we used that all the time with new clients and existing clients.
Yeah, her methodology for gathering that qualitative insight into the buying journey and decision process is really powerful.
Oh, and again, I like it so much because we used it and it was so effective. And I think that, people in the marketing agency business or, all these self-proclaimed experts you see on your LinkedIn feed, right now they're all experts on AI. Last year, they were experts on NFTs and crypto. And before that, they were all experts on the metaverse. But I digress. Everyone wants you to think that there's some secret sauce. There's like, what's the thing at the end of Indiana Jones? It was like the Ark of the Covenant or something.
Right.
There's no secret sauce to any of this. But I think the closest thing to it is understanding your customer. And that's where this book buyer persona comes in. And my last content director, former business journalist, and former journalists make excellent content marketers. It was the first book I had him read. And basically, it's 20 to 30-minute interviews with a series of customers. You got to pick the right kind of customer, and the book can explain that to you. But what would happen that was so funny to me is we would say to our clients, look, we're going to go do these interviews. We need to speak to certain types of customers, maybe even some that didn't buy from you, or some that represent groups you want to get more of. And so they'd say, yeah, that's great. Well, you go do that marketing thing. I'm sure you've heard that before, Ed. So then we would interview them, following the guidance they had. And we would come back with our findings and recommendations, and the client would say one of two things, if not both. One is, man, you really understand our customers. And we're like, we're kind of like Penn and Teller, except we tell you beforehand the magic trick we're going to do. And they were like, yeah, they weren't paying attention. They say, you really understand our customers. Then they would say, I forgot how much goes on in their world before they come to us. Back to your point about these customers are 70, maybe 90% through deciding on solving a problem before they reach out to you. Most people would prefer to have a salesperson free experience. So that was, something that I just found invaluable in all the books that I read, all the hundreds and hundreds of books. A lot of it kind of came back to that one book about just those 5 insights about your customer. And I gave presentations about that. It was really helpful. So I'll ease out. I have to be very careful. I'm like a bartender that's excited about all the different mixed drinks I can make, because I want you to have all of them. And it's like, I have to be careful not to recommend too many books or people will get overwhelmed. And actually, I've always said that if I can recommend 1 or 2 books that will help someone with their particular challenge right now, please let me do that. I don't want anyone, not even Ed Marsh, to have to read 500 sales and marketing books to find the 1 or 2 that might help right now. And as a result, I still get contacted by listeners around the world saying, what's a good book about these aspects of account-based marketing, or, something about a particular type of sale or so forth. So, your listeners can feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn and, let me know that you heard this conversation, that you're challenged with something, and I might be able to send you a link to an interview. But do it now, act now, because the website's coming down at the end of 2024. But the podcast will still be out there, forever.
Well, good list. Thank you. Periodically, I see on LinkedIn some of your kind of conversation or promotion of an episode, and you've got a photograph of the book open and some of your handwritten notes in there. My sense is that you prefer to read in hardcover books. Is that correct?
Yeah, always. Okay. And I absorb it better. And I think there's some science behind why you scan more when you have a screen. But with the book, I'm able to make notes in it of the questions I might want to ask, or as the things I post on LinkedIn are usually jokes I tell myself while I'm reading the book. Sometimes I'll take a picture of that and post it on LinkedIn. Most of them are kind of off color, so I could share them with Ed Marsh probably, but not everyone. So yeah, I do that. And over the years, what I would do is I would hear from a lot of authors, and they'd say, hey, I really like to be on your podcast. And the first thing I would say is, great, here's a link to a video explaining the types of books I feature, because to make sure yours is a fit, And if you want to be considered, you need to send me a hard copy of the book as a next step. And I would always do that because for some magical reason, Ed, once an author booked an interview, somehow it became almost impossible for them to send me that book, even though they promised they would. So it was a practical reason. But also, I wanted to evaluate the book and see if it, a variety of things, because over the years, I had one guy come on the podcast who was a friend of mine who I had known even before I started the podcast. And I told him I was starting the podcast. I said, do you have a book? And he says, yeah, I'm thinking about one in a couple of years. And I had him come on, and I enjoyed the interview. And it was a first-time book, and it was self-published, and it wasn't as good as the other books. And I heard from listeners around the world, and it was like, oh, man, what a nice problem to have. Now they're relying on me. Right. So I really had to be careful about which books I would, because basically being a guest was an endorsement. So
do you see any kind of dissonance between the fact that you're doing this in an audio format, but you're not using Audible, you're not using Kindle, you're using hard copy?
I'm not sure I understand.
So the way, I guess, well, so let me ask the question differently. Was your idea of the podcast as a proxy for reading for people? So in other words, they could listen to the episode and get the essence of the book without reading it, kind of like Cliff Notes? Or was it to help people discover books to read?
The latter.
Okay.
But actually, as I said, it was really more about me and my needs, Ed. But it was, what happened was, yes, a lot of people would listen and they would catch a lot of the key points from the book. And I would usually ask questions about things that surprised me or that I thought would be helpful. What I later found out was that a lot of people would listen to the podcast to decide if they wanted to spend time reading the book. It was never about the money of buying a book. It was all about, do I want to spend 2 weeks reading a book or spend time with them? And they're just trying to, I'm the same way when I read a book that's not about marketing or sales. I'm like, I want to read the sample on a Kindle maybe, or, I don't want to waste my time. It's kind of like watching a movie and you start a movie and it's like, this is terrible. I don't want to keep watching.
Do you ever use Audible?
No. I've listened to one audiobook, and it was Joe Polizzi, founder of the Content Marketing Institute. He'd been on several times, and he wrote a murder mystery, but it was about a marketing guy. And he said, hey, can I come on and talk about this book? And I thought, oh, wow, that sounds like a lot of fun. And what he was doing, which was very significant for content marketing and building an audience, is what he did. This is a little bit in the weeds, but he released the book as a podcast. Each chapter was an episode, but he released it all at once with a professional actor, voice actor. And then what he did was he released it as an ebook, or a Kindle book. Mm-hmm. Once he got that feedback, and then finally, after maybe making a few recommendations or changes, he released it as a printed version. So I had to listen to the audio book, and I really had to pay attention, and it's a little slower. And what's probably amusing to you and me is that one of the characters was a Vietnam vet, and there was some murder mystery. So there were some issues about weapons that were being used in the narration. And I contacted him right away and said, no, that's the wrong term. You might want to go to a gun store and get some information about what some of these. Glock doesn't make a revolver, for instance, stuff like that. But only a small number of people like you and me would find that amusing. So that's the only one I ever listened to. And there were very few that I read. In the early days, I read some Kindle versions. And then once I hit the 400 book episode, I reached out to a number of those authors and said, I bought your Kindle, but I collect all the audits, as many as I can, autographed copies of the books. And I reached out to a number of the ones in the early days, and I said, do you still have some books left over? And they said, absolutely. And they sent me copies of the books. Recently, for the Buyer Persona book, was the first one in a long time where I had to read a digital version just because I wanted to interview him, and the printed versions weren't quite ready. But normally I would ask an author to wait until they could send me a printed version. And there's actually one more I'm going to read digitally, and then they promised to send me a hard copy.
So with hardcovers, you're taking marginal notes. How do you? I mean, you seem to have an encyclopedic recollection of the essence and the key points and the data points and the authors and all of that kind of stuff about these books, which I find remarkable. But maybe sometimes you struggle the same way I do to recall those details, and I'm wondering how you surface those notes if they're all in the margin of books.
Well, there's what I'll do is I'll just write down things that interested me and maybe a question I could ask, because I'm reading the book thinking about preparing for the interview right off the bat. Mm-hmm. Of course, you have to understand and absorb the book, which I just love doing. But I'll figure out what questions I want to ask. Then the day before, I will do what I call a flip through, and I flip through the book and look at what I marked up. Mm-hmm. Then I come here to my desk and I put on a headset and I pull up the script from the last week, make a new copy, and it's for this new author. And I will then use Google Documents and I'll dictate the questions I want to ask. Because after I do a flip through, I'll realize, no, I don't want to talk about that. I don't want to talk about that. So that's kind of how I do that. For one that's digital, what I have to do is I have a tablet and I'm reading that. And then I have to have my iPhone available. And then I will dictate into that the question I want to ask or whatever. And I'll say what page it is. It's like Evernote. There's a lot of software that can do that. But so that's kind of how I did it. So it's a little bit of a culling exercise. And then there's a few questions I always ask at the end. And then usually getting their bio is pretty easy for the introduction.
Right.
So kind of a little bit of a system. And then after in the past, I would have an employee edit the episode. And then I found out a few years back that a lot of podcasters, even people that could afford to have anybody edit these things, they would still edit the episode themselves because it made them better interviewers. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. So I started doing it myself. And even to the point where I would still edit it myself, and then I would hand off that audio file to someone else to take care of all the details. But now I do it all myself. But the reason I'm mentioning that is I use Teamwork. Any kind of software where you've got templates and checklists, there's about 75 steps you have to follow that I have. It's nothing more than what you would see a pilot do, where I did that. Oh, I forgot about that. And it's all in a certain order and it makes it go really fast and usually zero defects. So that's how I do it. That's the magic.
Interesting. Shifting gears, you had your years in Germany when you were in the Army, but you brought in an outsider when you wanted to interview or have Renee Neubach interviewed in German. So I guess you really are a practice your beer drinking more than you practice your language. Is that the takeaway?
Well, perhaps, but you see, I thought that my German improved if I was drinking German beer. Kind of like if you are drinking beer when you're skiing, you think it improves your skiing, but really all it does is it improves your perception of your German or your skiing. So, but Renee Neubach's a friend, and I knew he was coming out with the German version of the Ask You Answer, which we mentioned earlier. And then there was another listener in Germany who I knew he had a podcast, but it was in German. And I said, that might make for a fun interview where you could interview Renee, and they had a lot in common. They met, and the whole thing would be in German. So we started out in English, long enough for me to say this is going to be in German. Right. And then tell us a few stupid German jokes, which my German and Austrian friends tolerated. And then they did that one. So I just thought it was kind of a fun thing to do, and I wanted to do what I could to help my friend Renee.
You obviously have access to a lot of data over the years, and I'm wondering, based on, say, the top 10 or 20 episode downloads, putting aside the title of the book and the author of the book, are there themes that you sense resonated the most with listeners?
Yeah, I would say, well, there are a few there was one author I've interviewed 5 times named Philip Kotler, and he's the father of modern marketing. He's 93 now. And sharper than you or I probably are or ever were. And he is so well known around the world that everyone would listen to his interviews, and with good reason. The other thing is that the more practical the topic, the more listens that I would get. But again, I'm not the best example because, well, something about content marketing or, how to make your website more effective or things like that. So if you had a book about purpose-driven marketing, it might not have done too well. I didn't have many of those. And that was fine because I would pick, I'm kind of like a lot of your listeners. I'm interested in the revenue and the profitability. And if I had someone pitch a book to me and I thought that a CEO or a head of sales would think that is arts and crafts party planning for people who work in the make it pretty department, that's marketing BS, I would tend to agree. And I would say no. And that's why I had over 70 books about sales on the show.
Right.
or books about sales and marketing alignment, or books about revenue, or books about allocating your marketing based on the profitability of which customers. A lot of companies are marketing to unprofitable customers. Again, don't going to go down that rabbit hole, but I would look and see if something was practical. I just wasn't interested in la la land of marketing. So I tended to want things that were.
Your audience must be largely marketers, right? I mean, it must be a relatively small percentage that are those business leaders.
Well, it's again, this is not probably the right way, because I had an enormous audience doesn't mean everyone should have an enormous audience. This is just sort of like me being the Pied Piper, and I've attracted a lot of listeners, but the audience is quite broad. So it's a lot of marketers, but based on the ones that have raised their hands and asked me questions, or I've gotten to meet, it's a lot of business owners, even small business owners. One guy owns a car, an automotive service company in St. Louis,
wow.
doing quite well. And then there's also Fortune 500 CEOs, there's CFOs that listen. A lot of academics listen. A lot of them had their students listen. A lot of young people starting out. But what was always so interesting to me is the number of salespeople that were listening to the show. Either that or they were the most talkative because they were listening very closely. And I think it brings to mind something from a book by Mark Hunter, a sales book called A Mind for Sales. And he told this story. He had worked in marketing and sales at Fortune 500 companies. So he understood marketing really, really well. But he's known as the sales hunter. And he told a story of one client he was helping. And the company owner said, look, there are these 2 young salespeople, and they're really, really doing well. They're selling a lot. And they were starting to think they were doing something illegal or underhanded or whatever. And they said, can you spend a little more time with those guys and just see if you can figure out what's going on there? Well, he did. It's not really why he was hired, but he says, sure, I'm gonna be dealing with all the salespeople. What these 2 young men were doing is they were spending a lot of time with the marketing department because they were always finding out what marketing was doing, and they were probably helping marketing, and they were getting a lot of marketing support. They started selling a lot more. They were maybe younger. They didn't have a lot of bad habits.
Right.
They were doing what they were told, but I thought that was really funny. And that I often theorized that was why a lot of salespeople listened to the show, not just because I have a lot of books about sales, but because I was a marketer who was interested in sales. And that's why a few times on episodes, this comes back to Douglas Burdett and Ed Marsh, I would say that, there's a reason why the U.S. Army sent their artillery officers to the infantry officer advanced course, because the more that artillery understood what was going on with the infantry and what the infantry needed and how they thought, the more effective they were going to be as artillery officers.
Sure.
100% true.
Right.
And that's why so many authors, sales book authors, had said, marketing people should be spending at least one day a month with salespeople.
Mm-hmm.
And they're frighteningly, some authors have talked about how salespeople and marketing people weren't even in the same country. They weren't in the same city.
Right.
If they were in the same building, they hadn't met the salespeople. And it's just a problem. That's why you want to get them as close together. And that's why. So anyway, as you can understand, there was in that talk I gave in Wisconsin, I was joking. I said, in the field artillery, there are certain things that are really very important to have, like howitzers, projectiles, powder, primers, survey equipment, fuel, food, water, a lot of training, mechanics. And then I would ask the audience, all of that is worthless if you don't have one thing. And I would ask them what it is. And the answer is a target. All of that stuff is completely worthless if you don't understand what the target is. Now,
Right.
Sometimes the sales folks need help picking the right prospect. And that's fair. But otherwise, if marketing doesn't understand what sales is doing, you're as worthless as an artillery unit just firing off into the wild blue yonder,
Sure.
completely oblivious to what the infantry is trying to accomplish.
Right.
And I don't mean to set aside the armor, but come on.
Yeah, we
I think
started
of armor
earlier.
as being in support of the infantry.
We spoke, well, I could tell you about another one of my podcast episodes with a guy who was in the 82nd in the armor. So you can imagine tanks that are falling out of airplanes and how well they tend to work. That's a whole nother topic. But we started talking about sales and marketing alignment early in this conversation. We kind of keep coming back to it. And it's I think, a critical point that people just don't understand.
Yeah. And something came to mind when you were talking earlier about a customer. They need information at different times. And if you can provide that to them, it's very helpful. And they're not making a distinction between, am I talking to a salesperson?
Exactly.
Am I on the website? Am I talking to a marketing person? They really don't care.
Right.
They're concerned about them making the right decision.
Right.
And that's, again, one of the reasons why the alignment of sales and marketing is so important. If you've got them siloed, you're really tying one hand behind your back. And there's a book, if you only read one book about sales and marketing alignment, I would recommend Align to Achieve. And that was written by a head of sales and a head of marketing who got on the same page at the software company they worked at and watched it take off. They had both worked at companies where it was aligned and where it wasn't aligned. And they basically wrote about how they went about doing that. But I believe in that book, there was serious decision research that showed that companies that have their sales and marketing more aligned grow faster and have greater profitability.
I'm sure. I haven't seen
It's
the
not
data.
a coincidence.
But yeah, exactly. For people who don't have time to do all the reading you do or make excuses for themselves and think they don't have time to do all the reading, knowing that your podcast is wrapping up soon, what other resources would you refer business owners or board directors or executives at industrial manufacturers to go to learn more? Other podcasts or YouTube channels or blogs or what?
I would all those things. I mean, they're kind of relying on people like you to uncover these things. They're very, very busy, as you know, and this isn't something they have the luxury of spending all their time on. So there would be that. I think podcast, YouTube. There's so much content out there. I would look to their any associations they belong to. My sense is that a lot of them belong to associations like that. Please don't read as many books as I did. You don't need to do that. Okay. But I think that there's several different ways to. There's associations. There's a lot of great marketing content out there. You're probably still using HubSpot. They still have a great blog. But try not to go to too many places. Pick a few that work for you and just focus on that.
You mentioned earlier that
it's really easy to get overwhelmed.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's tons of stuff. I think that's part of the reason podcasts are helpful, because people, I think, don't interrupt their schedule to sit down and read articles the way they used to. So now they need to consume information more passively. They need to access that pre-awareness and awareness business kind of introduction to business issues they might not be thinking of, or help them frame it in a different way so they can approach it, look at it differently. Podcasts and I think video increasingly helps people do that. It's one of the main takeaways from the second edition of Marcus Sheridan's book that you talked about. But going back to your start with podcasts, you said you enjoyed them. When you consume a podcast now, what speed do you listen at?
Oh, I always listen at the normal
really?
Speed. Yeah. But you know what? A few years back, good number of years back, I stopped listening to marketing and sales podcasts because I would either beat myself up because they had asked a question I should have asked or whatever, or they would cover a topic that I just wasn't as in depth as this one guy, me, would have gotten from reading a book about that topic. So it's kind of unfair to the other podcasters to say that. And I was also concerned about copying things that other folks were doing. So I was really just listening to podcasts for fun, because I was reading the books and keeping up with things that were going on. So I tend to listen to a lot of military history podcasts, no surprise to you, or comedy podcasts or something like that. I wasn't using it for professional development because I was already doing that with this podcast, but I'm probably the only guy that was, in that situation, just set up to do that.
In terms of marketing, you're not in the game anymore. So how would you answer agency versus in-house, particularly for technical, industrial, capital equipment kinds of things?
That's a great question. And back to the book I mentioned at the very beginning, Lean Marketing by Alan Dib. It's a very new book. He tackles that. He's grown some enormous companies in Australia, telecom, all this sort of thing. And along the way, he wasn't a marketer, but he figured out that was the one thing that had the greatest impact. So he kind of zeroed in on marketing over the years. And so he started writing these books about what he had noticed. And he talks about the use of an agency. And in his book, and I couldn't agree more with it, and you can find that interview, Lean Marketing, on the Marketing Podcast. If folks want to find that and listen to it, because we talk about this, where he said, one of the worst things you can do, and he wasn't the only one to talk about this, Marcus Sheridan talks about it as others, the worst thing you can do is try to outsource the whole thing. It would be like outsourcing your R&D or your manufacturing. Wait a minute. This is one of the things that you need to have a handle on. You need to understand the basics, and he covers that in the book. But for instance, he says one of the worst things you can do is hire a full service agency, because there is no such thing as a full service agency anymore. He says you should hire technical experts, but you are responsible for giving them very clear direction, which they need, they want. But you can't do that if you are not even thinking about it. That has to be one of the dials on the CEO's dashboard, is a basic understanding of what it is you're trying to accomplish. Back to my friend Frank, or back to Alan Dib's book. And again, Alan's book is fresh on my mind, but I really, really liked it. So in terms of outsourcing it, there's Peter Drucker, the father of modern management. He said, a business is there to create a customer. And the only two things that add value to a business are innovation and marketing. And people can Google that and research why he says that. So as a CEO, you should be focusing on how to innovate, which kind of requires an understanding of your customers. You have probably very capable people running your business. Doesn't mean you shouldn't be involved with them, but the other is the marketing. And if you understand your customers, your marketing is going to be a lot more effective. You're probably going to spend less. and you'll have faster results. Right. So that's where I think there's a thought of, oh, marketing, that's like getting a new photocopy machine. That's not something I have to worry about. Well, the really successful companies are the ones where the leadership understands what modern marketing can do for them. They don't have to know how to do a TikTok video, please, but they understand the strategy and how that might help. And it also helps them to determine what they can stop doing. There's a lot of promotional activity that companies can do that are doing where they should probably stop and watch what happens. Nothing.
We got to talk about AI, and I'm wondering if any of your guests whom you've asked about AI have offered any sort of a cautionary perspective, or is everyone just a raving fan, all in on all of the wonderful things it's going to do?
No, but I'm a little bit older, and every 5 years or so, something comes along where they say, oh, this is the new thing. Everything is going away. I can remember in the late 90s, there was this .com thing. And I can remember having clients who would say, look, brick and mortar stores are going away. Okay. It's all this or it's all that. Again, back to the experts on LinkedIn every 2 or 3 years. Right. And this takes me back to in the mid 90s, early 90s, I was watching one of those Sunday morning television shows, and it was a Fortune magazine show. And they had these experts, different writers, talking about in one segment about the internet. And they didn't quite have a handle on what does that mean? And they were saying, they were kind of speculating on what they thought was going to happen. And they were doing their best. And one writer said, well, and he was different from the others. He goes, I think it's going to have more to do with the computer on the desk rather than television. This is the early days. And he was right, but they just didn't know. And I kind of think that's where we are now, where there's a lot of self-proclaimed experts and there's a lot of wailing and gnashing of teeth. I think that it is a fantastic tool for certain things. And I just saw something the other day, and I've read this in a few books about how you're not going to lose your job to AI. You're going to lose your job to an employee or a business that is using AI. So it's a wonderful tool. And at that conference in Wisconsin, Andy Crestodina was there, and he's written an excellent book called Content Chemistry. And he's coming out with the 7th edition because it's got a lot of AI in it. That's one of those desk references, like one of those 5 books that some of which I've mentioned already that every marketer has found very helpful. And he gave this wonderful presentation about how he has used it. Now, he's using it simply as a research tool. Mm-hmm. It's not writing anything for him. And it's speeding things up tremendously. So there's a lot of doomsaying out there. And there have been a few books I've had on about AI. And there's a guy that we both know named Paul Reitzer at the Marketing AI Institute. Right. And he's written a book about, AI and marketing. And they're getting word every week about a new tool, and they're evaluating them, and they're trying to keep track of them all and seeing what, following the developments. And it's a very interesting topic. That book of Paul's, he is explaining a framework for how to think about it, how it can help you. But I think he and all his colleagues will say, no, I'm not worried about HAL from 2001 Space Odyssey. It's just a matter of, are you going to use these things to make things better for your customers? And what's interesting is, like with Amazon, you get notified by Amazon when you get an email that says, hey, we got your order. And then they say, another one says, it's going to come on this day. And it was back to the guy, Bill Price, who I interviewed, the Amazon employee. And he was one of the guys at the beginning who said, and he said this throughout his career, is like, we are able to get the number of minutes speaking to customers in our call center down to a certain point. And his whole philosophy was, okay, but why are they having to call?
Right.
Because they don't really want to have to call. And so that's where, like at Amazon, they were like, oh, everyone wants to know if we got their order. Why don't we just send an email? And so there was another book recently called Blue Goldfish 2.0 by Stan Phelps, and they explain, they show hundreds of examples of companies that are using AI to simply help make things better for their customers. What happens is, because Amazon can tell you what day your package is going to arrive, it's called the Amazon effect. Everyone expects to be able to be told that. And I can remember hearing the story about this MRI manufacturer, machine manufacturer, and they weren't able to tell the medical practice what day it was going to arrive. I don't know if you've ever had an MRI, but those things are big. It involves a big truck, and the medical practice kind of has to be ready for it. And they still couldn't say, well, it's going to be there on the 25th. And the problem was they would say, yeah, but our competition doesn't do that. And the point is, yeah, but your competition isn't any better than you are. If Amazon can tell you when your box of chocolates are going to arrive, you should be able to tell. So it creates this expectation. Right. And I think that's where AI is it's really no different. People are going to say, well, you're able to know enough about me to make good recommendations, like for stuff I'm buying or based on the kind of motorcycle I have or what shows I'm watching or what kind of books I have. Why am I having to work harder with you to deliver the kind of serious service I want? And then they say, well, all right, but this other guy's doing it, so it's easier.
Yeah, I think the Goldman Sachs report from about 3 weeks ago is really an important counterpoint to a lot of the hype that we hear. And there's no doubt that it improves efficiency in a number of ways. The question is whether the financial model supports an efficiency boost. I mean, really, the only way the financial model of AI works is if it fundamentally changes the way things get done. And it's at this point looking increasingly unlikely that it does that. And so if what we're talking about is an efficiency boost because it helps you research faster, if we were really paying our share, if you will, of the cost to build that infrastructure and the power infrastructure to support and everything else, that efficiency boost isn't worth what it's going to cost. So it's going to be interesting to see how it shakes out.
Yeah, it does. And that's where just because you can do something doesn't necessarily mean you need to. Right. And it doesn't, it's like marketing. It's like not everybody needs to be doing all these things. So yeah, that's just, I'm not familiar with that report, but just on, I listen to the Wall Street Journal News podcast. It comes out twice a day, and they were talking about how there were some sort of earnings expectations, and they were talking about how is the business case there yet?
Right.
Again, people should Google the Gartner hype cycle, which I'm sure you're familiar with, which is like everything that comes out. There's this over expectation, and then this, I think that's called, and then it goes down, and it's the
trough of disillusionment, I think.
Trough, yeah, something like that, the slow of disillusionment or something like that. And then over time, slowly later, it starts to catch up. By then, a lot of people said, that's stupid. That doesn't work. And think back to the internet, the advent of the internet. It was like, oh yeah, bricks and mortar is going away. No, it just made everything a little bit better. But there was a lot of carnage. And in fact, I think the Super Bowl just before the .com crash, over half the Super Bowl commercials were for these .com startups, and almost all of them went out of business. It's just such a great case study. But I know I sound like an old man yelling at the clouds here. But
all right, well, we'll wrap up then. That's a good point for us to wrap up before we date ourselves or kind of act silly. Thank you for your insights. Thank you for your patience. It's intimidating to interview somebody who's a vastly more experienced interviewer. So thank you for not calling me out or embarrassing me along the way. As we wrap up, any particular thoughts that you want to share?
Well, I think you're a very good interviewer. And I sound like a good interviewer simply because I read the book. So that's helped me prepare for it. No, I just think that if I can, again, if I can help point somebody in the right direction to a good resource, any of your audience, or a book recommendation or whatever, please let me know. I'm not available for hire. I'm retiring. I don't want to work. I want to bang on the drum all day. So, but I would like to help folks if I can certainly do that. And I hope that we can keep in touch given our many shared interests. Ed.
Absolutely. I look forward to that. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate you joining me today, Douglas. For everyone listening, you know what you need to do. Please like the episode, share it, comment on it, subscribe to it. And thank you for spending time with Douglas and me today listening to this conversation.